Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like, and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
I never thought my family would fall apart like this. My parents had been married for 30 years, a milestone most couples never reach. They were the kind of pair everyone admired. The hardworking dad, the loving mom, the glue that kept everything together. They seemed unshakable. But everything changed the day I walked into my mom's office unannounced. It wasn't even supposed to happen. I had left my laptop charger at their house, and when I mentioned it to my mom, she said she could bring it to her office if I needed it sooner. It was supposed to be a quick exchange. I thought I'd just drop by, grab my charger, and be on my way. I didn't even call ahead. When I arrived, her assistant wasn't at the desk, which was unusual. The office door was slightly ajar, and I heard muffled voices. Assuming she was in a meeting, I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the door open a little further, and that's when I saw it. My mom was sitting on the office couch, her so-called business partner leaning over her. They weren't reviewing reports or discussing strategy. They were kissing, deeply, passionately, in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. My feet felt rooted to the ground, my brain struggling to catch up with what my eyes were seeing. This was my mom, the woman who had always preached about honesty and loyalty, tangled up with someone who definitely wasn't my dad. They didn't notice me at first. The room felt like it was moving in slow motion as I stood there, frozen in place. My heart pounded in my ears so loudly I thought I might pass out. When my mom finally looked up and saw me standing there, her face went pale. Her eyes widened, her mouth opening and closing like she was searching for words but couldn't find them. "This isn't what it looks like," she stammered, her voice trembling. I couldn't even process her words. I didn't stay long enough for her to explain, or try to explain. My legs finally remembered how to move, and I turned and walked out of the office, my heart racing and my head spinning. The drive home was a blur. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly they hurt, but I barely noticed. My mind was consumed with questions. How long had this been going on? Who was that guy? Did Dad know? By the time I got home, the initial shock had given way to a boiling anger. How could she do this? My dad worked so hard to provide for our family, and she'd always been his biggest supporter, or so I thought. I couldn't wrap my head around what I'd just seen. I thought about calling her, but what would I even say? Instead, I paced my apartment, replaying the scene over and over in my mind. I didn't know what to do or who to tell. If I said something to my dad, it could blow up their marriage. But if I stayed silent, I'd be complicit in her betrayal. The next day, my mom called me. I stared at my phone as it rang, debating whether to pick up. Finally, I answered, my voice flat. "What do you want?" She hesitated before speaking, and I could hear the guilt in her voice. "We need to talk," she said. "Do we?" I shot back. "Because I think I saw everything I needed to see yesterday." "It's not what you think," she said quickly, but the words sounded rehearsed. "It was a mistake, a moment of weakness." I laughed bitterly. "A moment of weakness? Is that what you call making out with your business partner in the office where you're supposed to be working?" She sighed. "I didn't mean for you to find out this way. I didn't mean for this to happen at all." "That's your excuse?" I said, my anger bubbling over. "You've been married to Dad for 30 years. How could you do this to him?" There was a long pause, and for a moment, I thought she might actually tell me the truth. But instead, she said, "Look, it's complicated. I can explain everything, but please, don't say anything to your father. This is between me and him." Her words sent a chill down my spine. She wasn't worried about how her actions might hurt him. She was worried about getting caught. "You've got to be kidding me," I said. "You're asking me to keep this from him? To lie for you?" "I'm asking you to give me time," she said, her voice breaking. "Please, just let me handle this." I hung up without answering. My hands were shaking, and my stomach churned with a mix of anger and sadness. The woman I had always looked up to, the one who had taught me right from wrong, was asking me to cover for her. For the next few days, I felt like I was living in a fog. Every time my dad texted me or called to check in, the guilt ate away at me. He didn't know, and every interaction felt like a lie by omission. My mom texted me constantly, begging me not to say anything, but I couldn't ignore the weight of what I knew. I didn't know how long I could keep this secret. All I knew was that everything had changed, and there was no going back to the way things were before. The hours after the discovery felt like a waking nightmare. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop replaying the scene in my head. My mom with her so-called business partner, the look of shock on her face when she saw me standing there. My emotions swung wildly between disbelief, anger, and sadness. This wasn't some stranger. It was my mom, the woman who baked cookies for PTA meetings, who stayed up late helping with school projects, who always seemed to have her life perfectly together. By the time I got home, I was seething. Every time I thought about my dad, his goofy laugh, his quiet devotion to our family, the anger grew. He didn't deserve this, but I also felt trapped. Should I tell him? Could I even bring myself to say the words? What if I was wrong about what I saw? Eventually, I realized there was only one way forward. I needed to confront my mom directly. I needed answers, and I needed them now. I called her that evening, my hands shaking as I dialed her number. She answered on the second ring, her voice light and casual, like nothing had happened. "Hi, sweetheart. How are you? We need to talk," I said, cutting her off. "Can you come over?" There was a pause on the other end, just long enough to let me know she understood why I was calling. Sure. I'll be there in an hour," she said, her voice suddenly tense. When she arrived, I barely let her get through the door before I started. "What the hell was that, Mom?" I demanded, my voice trembling with anger. She blinked, clearly caught off guard by my tone. "What are you talking about?" she asked, as though she didn't already know. "In your office," I said, my voice rising. "You and your business partner. Don't even try to deny it. I saw everything." Her face went pale, and for a moment, she didn't say anything. Then, as if flipping a switch, she tried to regain control of the situation. "It was a mistake," she said quickly. "A moment of weakness. It didn't mean anything." I stared at her, incredulous. "A moment of weakness?" I repeated. "You've been married to Dad for 30 years. 30 years. And you're telling me this meant nothing?" Her hands shook as she clutched her purse. "It's complicated," she said, avoiding my eyes. "No," I said firmly. "It's not complicated. It's simple. You're cheating on Dad." She flinched like I'd slapped her. "I never meant for it to happen," she said, her voice breaking. "It's just, your dad and we've been going through a rough patch." I felt neglected. I felt my stomach churn. Neglected? Are you serious? Dad practically worships the ground you walk on. If you were having issues, why didn't you talk to him? Why this? She looked away, tears welling in her eyes. "You don't understand," she whispered. "You're right, I don't," I shot back. "Because nothing about this makes sense. You're risking your entire marriage, our entire family, for what? Some guy from work?" Her defenses started to crumble. She wiped at her eyes and took a shaky breath. "I made a mistake," she said finally. "A terrible mistake. But it's not what you think. It's not serious. It's over." I shook my head, disbelief washing over me. "You expect me to believe that? After what I saw?" She reached out, as if to comfort me, but I stepped back. "Please," she said, her voice trembling. "Don't say anything to your dad. It'll destroy him. We can work through this as a family, quietly. No one else needs to know." Her words sent a chill down my spine. She wasn't apologizing because she felt guilty. She was apologizing because she was afraid of the consequences. This wasn't about fixing her marriage. It was about saving face. "You want me to lie to him?" I asked, my voice cold. "To keep this secret for you?" "I'm asking you to give me time," she said, her eyes pleading. "I need to fix this on my own terms. Please." For a long moment, I didn't say anything. My mind was racing, torn between anger and heartbreak. I wanted to believe her, to trust that she would make things right. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was only trying to buy herself time. "I don't know if I can do that," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked like she was about to argue, but then she stopped. Instead, she nodded, her expression a mix of resignation and desperation. "Just think about it," she said. When she left, I felt even worse than before. Confronting her hadn't brought me any clarity. If anything, it had made things more complicated. Now, I wasn't just carrying the weight of what I'd seen. I was also carrying the burden of her plea for silence. For the next few days, her words echoed in my head. "It'll destroy him." She was probably right. My dad adored her. Learning the truth would shatter him. But every time I thought about keeping quiet, I felt sick to my stomach. How could I look him in the eye, knowing what I knew? I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that the family I thought I knew, the family I thought was unbreakable, was hanging by a thread. And no matter what I chose to do, there would be no going back to the way things were before. The days after my confrontation with my mom were some of the most emotionally draining of my life. Every time I saw my dad, I felt a crushing weight of guilt, like I was betraying him just by keeping quiet. He didn't know the truth, and yet there he was, kind, trusting, completely unaware of the storm brewing right under his roof. My mom, on the other hand, wouldn't leave me alone. She texted me constantly, begging me not to say anything. "We just need time." One message read, "Your dad and I can work through this if you give us a chance." Another said, "Please, don't make this worse. I love your father. I'm going to fix this." I didn't know what to believe. Part of me wanted to trust her, to give her the chance to make things right. But every time I thought about what I had seen, the anger bubbled back up. How could she claim to love him and then do something so destructive? And why should I have to carry this secret when it wasn't mine to bear? Things came to a head one evening during a quiet dinner with my dad. He was telling me about a project he was working on for his job, a hint of excitement in his voice as he described the details. "You know," he said, taking a sip of his drink, "I really admire how dedicated your mom is to her work. She's always putting in the extra effort, staying late to make sure everything's perfect. It's one of the things I love most about her, her passion for what she does." His words hit me like a freight train. I could barely meet his eyes, my stomach churning with guilt. He had no idea that the late nights he admired were a lie. No idea that the woman he trusted completely had betrayed him. I nodded weakly, unable to form a response. I pushed my food around on my plate, pretending to listen as he continued to talk, but my mind was spinning. I couldn't keep this from him. Not anymore. That night, after dinner, I sat in my room, rehearsing what I was going to say. My heart pounded in my chest as I imagined the conversation, the look on his face, the fallout that would inevitably follow. But no matter how hard it was, I knew it was the right thing to do. "Dad," I said, knocking on his study door a little later, "can we talk for a minute?" "Of course," he said, gesturing for me to sit down. "What's on your mind?" I hesitated, my hands trembling. "This isn't easy to say," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. "But there's something you need to know." He furrowed his brow, his expression shifting to concern. "What is it?" I took a deep breath, forcing myself to keep going. "It's about Mom. I saw something. At her office." The words came tumbling out then, faster than I could stop them. I told him everything, the charger, the open door, the kiss. Every detail felt like a knife twisting in my chest, but I couldn't stop. He needed to know. When I finished, the room fell silent. My dad stared at me, his expression a mix of confusion and disbelief. "That doesn't sound like your mother," he said finally, shaking his head. "She would never do something like that." I didn't want to believe it either, I said, my voice cracking, but I saw it with my own eyes. "I'm so sorry, Dad." He leaned back in his chair, his hands gripping the armrests tightly. For a moment, I thought he might deny it outright, but then something in his face shifted. The disbelief gave way to something else, something darker. "She's been coming home late a lot lately," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I thought it was just work. I didn't think." His voice trailed off, and for the first time in my life, I saw my dad look truly vulnerable. The hurt in his eyes was like a punch to the gut. "Thank you for telling me," he said after a long pause. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, like he was holding back a tidal wave of emotion. "I'll handle it from here." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, second-guessing myself. Had I done the right thing? Or had I just torn my family apart? But deep down, I knew I didn't have a choice. My dad deserved to know the truth, even if it hurt. And as much as I hated the idea of what might come next, I also felt a strange sense of relief. The weight of the secret was no longer mine to carry. The next morning, my dad left the house early. He didn't say where he was going, but I had a pretty good idea. My mom was unusually quiet that day, her phone clutched tightly in her hand, her expression tense. She must have sensed that the clock was ticking. As the day went on, the tension in the house became unbearable. I didn't know what my dad was planning or how my mom would respond, but one thing was certain. The truth was out now, and there was no going back. The morning after I told my dad the truth, the tension in the house was suffocating. Normally, my mom would be bustling around the kitchen, humming to herself as she made coffee, while my dad read the news on his tablet. But today, the house was eerily silent. My dad had locked himself in their bedroom with my mom, and I could hear the muffled sound of voices rising and falling through the walls. It started as a low hum, like they were trying to keep it civil, but as the minutes turned into hours, the arguing became louder, more heated. I tried to distract myself with TV, music, anything to drown out the sound, but it was impossible. Every word I caught, Betrayal. Why? I can't believe you. Felt like another crack forming in the foundation of our family. When the door finally opened, it was like a dam had burst. My mom emerged first, her face blotchy and red from crying. She didn't say anything to me, just hurried past and disappeared into the bathroom. My dad followed a moment later, and my heart sank when I saw him. He looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight. His normally bright, sharp eyes were dull, and the slump in his shoulders made him seem smaller somehow, as if the weight of what he'd learned had physically diminished him. "I can't stay here right now," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. He grabbed his coat and car keys from the counter. "Dad, wait," I said, stepping toward him. "Where are you going?" "Don't worry about me," he replied, not meeting my eyes. My mom came out of the bathroom just as he was heading for the door. "Please don't go," she said, her voice cracking. "We can work this out. I'll do anything." He stopped for a moment, his hand on the doorknob. For a second, I thought he might turn around, but then he shook his head. "I need time to think," he said, and without another word, he walked out the door. I stood there in stunned silence, my mom sobbing quietly behind me. It felt like I was watching my family crumble in real time, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Over the next few days, the house became a shell of what it used to be. My dad checked into a nearby hotel, and while he texted me occasionally to let me know he was okay, he didn't say much about what he was thinking or feeling. My mom, on the other hand, was a mess. She alternated between crying uncontrollably and pretending like nothing had happened, as if denial could somehow fix the situation. "It's just a temporary separation," she told me one evening, sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of wine. "Your father and I will work this out. We always do." I didn't have the heart to argue with her, but deep down, I knew better. My dad wasn't the type to forgive easily, and this wasn't just a small argument about finances or chores. This was betrayal on a level that shattered trust, and once trust is broken like that, it's almost impossible to fix. My mom spent the week alternating between damage control and outright panic. She tried calling my dad several times, but he either didn't pick up or kept the conversations brief. When she wasn't trying to reach him, she was glued to her phone, probably texting her business partner or Googling advice on how to salvage a marriage after infidelity. One evening, about a week after my dad left, I found her sitting on the couch, scrolling through old photo albums. She looked up when I came in, her eyes glassy. "Do you remember this?" she asked, holding up a picture of the three of us at the beach. I nodded, unsure of what to say. "We were so happy back then," she said, her voice trembling. "How did it come to this?" I wanted to tell her that it came to this because of her choices, but the words felt too cruel to say out loud. Instead, I sat down next to her and said, "I don't know, Mom." She sniffled and closed the album. "I just wish I could take it all back," she said. "I wish I could make it right." I didn't respond. Part of me felt sorry for her, sorry that she was clearly drowning in regret, but another part of me couldn't shake the anger I still felt. She had made this mess, and now we were all paying the price for it. Meanwhile, my dad was slowly coming to terms with the situation in his own way. One night, he texted me and asked if I could come by the hotel to talk. I agreed, and when I arrived, he greeted me with a weary smile. "How are you holding up?" he asked, motioning for me to sit down. "I should be asking you that," I replied. He sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "It's been a lot," he admitted, "but I'm glad you told me. I would have hated to find out any other way." His words brought a lump to my throat. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. "I didn't want to hurt you." "You didn't," he said firmly. "What hurt was knowing that she wasn't honest with me. But you did the right thing." Hearing that lifted a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. For days, I had been second-guessing my decision, wondering if I had done more harm than good. But knowing my dad appreciated my honesty made it all worth it. As the week dragged on, it became clear that the situation wasn't going to resolve itself anytime soon. My dad showed no signs of coming back, and my mom showed no signs of taking accountability for her actions. The house felt emptier with each passing day, the silence a constant reminder of the fractures in our family. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear. Things would never go back to the way they were. And as much as that hurt, part of me knew it was for the best. Some truths, once uncovered, can't be ignored. It didn't take long for my mom's carefully constructed story to fall apart. For days, she clung to the narrative that what had happened was a mistake, a single lapse in judgment that didn't mean anything. But my dad wasn't the type to take things at face value, especially not when the stakes were this high. About a week after moving into the hotel, he called me and said, "I've hired someone to look into her business partner." His voice was tight, barely masking the hurt simmering beneath the surface. A private investigator? I asked, surprised. Yes, he said. I need to know the full truth. I can't just sit here and wonder. I didn't blame him. After 30 years of marriage, being blindsided by something like this would make anyone desperate for answers. But I wasn't prepared for just how deep the betrayal went. A few days later, my dad called me again, his tone grim. We need to talk, he said. When I arrived at the hotel, he was sitting at the small table near the window, a stack of papers in front of him. He motioned for me to sit, his expression unreadable. The investigator got back to me, he began. And it's worse than I thought. I braced myself. What did they find? He slid a report across the table. As I read through it, my stomach churned. Not only had my mom been seeing this guy for months, far longer than she'd admitted, but her so-called business partner wasn't even who he claimed to be. The man, whose name was Robert, was married with 2 kids. His wife had no idea about the affair, and from what the investigator uncovered, he had a history of similar behavior. There were rumors of other women, shady business deals, and even a prior lawsuit involving workplace misconduct. It wasn't just a mistake, my dad said, his voice shaking. She didn't just betray me. She betrayed our entire family. The revelation sent shockwaves through our lives. My dad, who had been clinging to the hope that this might be salvageable, was now resolute. There's no coming back from this, he said. I gave her 30 years of my life, and this is what she does? With him? Relatives who had always admired my parents' seemingly perfect marriage started asking questions. My aunt called me one evening, her voice laced with disbelief. I can't believe your mom would do something like this, she said. Your parents were the gold standard for the rest of us. Friends who used to come over for dinner parties began keeping their distance. It was as if my mom's actions had tainted everything we had built as a family, turning what once felt solid into something fragile and uncertain. My mom tried to control the narrative, of course. She called relatives, offering vague explanations about a misunderstanding and insisting that things were being blown out of proportion. But the details were too damning to ignore. The fallout wasn't just emotional. It was logistical, too. My dad, furious and determined to protect what was left of our family's dignity, insisted on contacting Robert's wife. She deserves to know the truth, he said. At first, I wasn't sure how to feel about it. Wouldn't that just make everything messy, eh? But as I thought about it, I realized he was right. Robert's wife had been betrayed just as much as my dad had, and she deserved to know who she was married to. When my dad finally made the call, it was brutal. I wasn't there, but he told me afterward how the woman on the other end had reacted. There were long silences, muffled sobs, and a quiet, trembling, "Thank you for telling me." For my dad, it was a small victory in an otherwise devastating situation. At least she knows now, he said. At least she won't waste any more of her life on him. Back at home, things only got more tense. My mom was furious when she found out about the call. "How could you do that?" she shouted at my dad during one of their rare conversations. "This is our business. You had no right. You lost the right to decide what's fair when you started lying to me," he shot back. "This isn't just about you anymore." The argument ended with my mom storming out of the house, slamming the door behind her. I sat in my room, listening to the echo of her footsteps fade away, feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief. Over the next few weeks, my dad began the process of unraveling their financial and personal ties. He met with a lawyer, gathered paperwork, and started making plans to file for divorce. My mom, on the other hand, seemed to be in denial. She still clung to the hope that things could be repaired, despite all evidence to the contrary. One evening, she sat me down and said, "I know I made a mistake, but your dad is being unreasonable. He's not even giving me a chance to explain." "Explain what, Mom?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "That you lied to him? That you lied to all of us? You've been seeing this guy for months, and you didn't think about what it would do to our family." She looked at me, her eyes welling with tears. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said softly. "But it did," I replied. "And now you have to deal with the consequences." The truth about my mom's affair didn't just expose cracks in her marriage. It shattered the image of her that I had held onto my entire life. She wasn't the person I thought she was, and coming to terms with that was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. As for my dad, the betrayal fueled a quiet but unrelenting resolve. "I won't let this define me," he told me one night. "I'm going to move on, even if it kills me to do it." It was heartbreaking to watch, but also inspiring in a way. Despite everything he had lost, My dad refused to let my mom's actions destroy him completely. And for that, I admired him more than ever. A few weeks after the full truth came out, my dad filed for divorce. Seeing those papers on the kitchen counter, with their cold legal language spelling out the end of 30 years of marriage, made everything feel real in a way it hadn't before. Up until that point, there had been a small, irrational part of me that believed things might somehow go back to normal. But the sight of those documents erased any lingering hope. 30 years. 3 decades of shared memories, triumphs, struggles, all reduced to a stack of paperwork and a series of tense meetings. It felt surreal. My mom's initial reaction was denial. "This is just a phase," she said to me one morning as I sipped my coffee. "Your dad's hurt, but once he cools down, he'll see that we can fix this." I didn't have the heart to argue with her. But when I saw my dad later that day, it was clear he wasn't cooling down. He was resolute. My mom's denial didn't last long. When the papers were officially served, she was forced to confront the reality of the situation. At first, she tried to fight it. She begged my dad to go to counseling, to at least talk things through before making such a drastic decision. "You're throwing everything away," she said during one of their rare conversations. "No," my dad replied calmly. "You already did that. I'm just making it official." His words were like a knife, sharp and unyielding. My mom broke down, sobbing in the middle of the kitchen. For a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for her. But then I remembered everything she had done. The lies, the betrayal, the way she had dragged all of us into her mess, and my sympathy evaporated. "You made your choice," my dad said, his voice steady but filled with quiet pain. "And now I'm making mine." The divorce process was even messier than I expected. After 30 years of marriage, my parents' lives were deeply intertwined in ways that made separating them a logistical nightmare. There were arguments about everything: the house, the savings, the car, even the dog. My dad wanted to sell the house and split the proceeds, but my mom insisted on keeping it. "This is my home," she argued. "I shouldn't have to leave." "It stopped being a home the moment you brought him into it," my dad shot back. The dog, a golden retriever named Max, became another point of contention. My dad loved Max, but my mom argued that she had been the one who adopted him. "You barely even walked him," she said during one heated exchange. "That's because I was too busy working to support this family," my dad retorted. Even their lawyers seemed exhausted by the constant bickering. "We need to focus on the big picture here," she said during one particularly tense meeting. "The longer this drags on, the harder it's going to be for everyone involved." The worst part wasn't the arguments or the logistical headaches. It was watching my dad's heartbreak every time he had to sit across from my mom in those meetings. I could see the pain in his eyes, even when he tried to hide it. Once, after a particularly difficult session, I found him sitting in his car in the parking lot, staring blankly out the window. "Dad," I said softly, knocking on the glass. He looked up, his expression weary. "Sorry," he said, forcing a small smile. "I just needed a minute." I climbed into the passenger seat, unsure of what to say. After a long silence, he finally spoke. "You think you know someone," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You think you've built a life with them, and then one day, it's like none of it mattered." "It mattered," I said quickly. "It still matters." He shook his head. "Not to her. Not anymore." I didn't know how to respond. All I could do was sit there, offering my presence as a small comfort in the face of his grief. Despite the emotional toll, my dad remained determined to see the divorce through. "I deserve better," he told me one evening as we sorted through old photo albums in preparation for the move. "I deserve someone who values me, who doesn't take me for granted." He was right, of course. But knowing that didn't make the process any easier. My mom, for her part, continued to oscillate between regret and bitterness. Some days, she would apologize profusely, begging my dad to reconsider. Other days, she would lash out, accusing him of being too rigid or unforgiving. "You're just throwing everything away because of one mistake," she said during one particularly heated argument. "It wasn't one mistake," my dad replied, his voice cold. "It was months of lies. Months of betrayal. You don't get to call that a mistake." Her face crumpled, and she turned away, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The divorce was finalized 6 months later. By the end of it, everyone involved seemed emotionally drained, like we had just emerged from a battlefield. My dad sold the house and moved into a modest apartment across town. My mom kept Max, though I could tell my dad hated giving him up. "This isn't how I pictured my life turning out," my dad admitted to me one night as we unpacked boxes in his new place. But maybe it's a chance to start over, to build something better. I nodded, my chest tight with emotion. Despite everything, I admired his resilience. He had every right to be bitter and angry, but instead, he was choosing to focus on moving forward. As for my mom, she seemed lost. She stayed in the house, but it felt emptier now, like a shell of the home it had once been. I visited her occasionally, but our conversations were strained, filled with unspoken tension and lingering resentment. The divorce had officially ended their marriage, but the emotional fallout was far from over. And as much as I wanted to believe that time would heal the wounds, I couldn't shake the feeling that some scars would never fully fade. The divorce didn't just split my parents apart, it fractured the entire family. Everyone had an opinion, and those opinions quickly turned into sides. My grandparents on my dad's side were livid when they found out about the affair. They had always adored my mom, welcoming her into the family with open arms when she married my dad, but now their affection had turned to disgust. What she did was disgraceful, my grandmother said during a family dinner. Her voice shook with emotion, her normally kind face hardened with anger. After all these years, after everything your father gave her, how could she do this? I didn't know how to respond. My dad, who was sitting at the table with us, simply nodded in agreement, his jaw clenched. It was clear that he wasn't ready to discuss it openly, and I couldn't blame him. On the other hand, my mom's parents took a different approach. They didn't condone what she had done, but they also didn't entirely blame her. Marriage is complicated. My maternal grandmother said to me over the phone one afternoon, there are always two sides to every story. I bit my tongue, not wanting to argue. But the implication that my dad somehow shared responsibility for my mom's betrayal didn't sit right with me. My younger brother, Jason, was caught in the middle more than anyone. He had always been closer to my mom, and I could tell he was struggling to reconcile the person he thought she was with the choices she had made. I just don't want to take sides, he said to me one night as we sat on the porch of my dad's new apartment. I get that, I replied. But it's hard not to when one side is clearly in the wrong. Jason sighed, running a hand through his hair. I know she screwed up, okay? But she's still our mom. And it's not like Dad's perfect either. I frowned. This isn't about being perfect, Jason. It's about trust. And she broke it. He didn't say anything after that, but I could tell he was wrestling with his feelings. As much as he wanted to stay neutral, even he couldn't hide his disappointment when he was around her. For me, it felt like walking a tightrope. I wanted to support my dad, who had been nothing but honest and transparent throughout the ordeal. But I also didn't want to lose my relationship with my mom entirely, even though every conversation with her was tinged with bitterness and regret. Whenever I visited her, I could feel the weight of her guilt hanging in the air. She tried to act normal, asking about work or offering me coffee, but there was an unspoken tension that neither of us could ignore. One evening, after an especially awkward dinner, she finally broke the silence. "Do you hate me?" she asked, her voice trembling. The question caught me off guard. I stared at her, unsure of how to respond. Did I hate her? No. But was I angry? Hurt? Disappointed? Absolutely. I don't hate you, I said finally, choosing my words carefully. But I don't know if I can forgive you either. Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought she might start crying. I know I've made mistakes, she said, but I'm still your mother. I hope we can get past this someday. I hope so too, I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. The tension extended beyond our immediate family. Friends who had once been regulars at our family gatherings began to drift away, unsure of how to navigate the situation. My mom's closest friends were divided. Some supported her, others sided with my dad. It was like a ripple effect, spreading discord through every relationship we had built over the years. Even casual acquaintances had opinions. At one point, a neighbor stopped me as I was leaving my mom's house. "How's your dad holding up?" she asked, her tone sympathetic. "He's doing okay," I replied, trying to keep my answer neutral. "Well, give him my best," she said, "and tell him he deserves better." It wasn't until I got into my car that I realized she hadn't asked about my mom at all. My dad, for his part, handled the growing divide with quiet dignity. He didn't badmouth my mom or try to sway anyone to his side, but he also didn't shy away from the truth when people asked. "She made her choices," he said simply when one of his friends asked what had happened. "Now I'm making mine." His composure was admirable, but I could see the toll it was taking on him. He threw himself into his work, spending long hours at the office or tinkering with projects around his apartment. When I visited, he would smile and act like everything was fine, but I could tell he was still grieving the loss of the life he had built with my mom. As the weeks turned into months, the divide within our family deepened. My dad leaned heavily on his side of the family for support, while my mom seemed to retreat further into isolation. Jason and I found ourselves stuck in the middle, trying to navigate the strained relationships without making things worse. Despite everything, I couldn't help but feel like I was losing a piece of myself. The family I had grown up with, the foundation I had always relied on, was gone. And in its place was a fractured version of what used to be, a version I wasn't sure could ever be whole again. But one thing was clear. There was no going back to the way things were. The lines had been drawn, and no matter how much I wanted to avoid taking sides, the choices we made, my dad, my mom, Jason, and me, would shape the future of our family for years to come. 6 months after the first papers were filed, the divorce was finalized. The day my dad officially signed the documents felt heavy, as though we had reached the end of a long, grueling journey. He didn't say much about it, but I could see the relief in his eyes. "It's done," he told me over the phone that evening. "We can finally move forward." Moving forward meant leaving behind the house we had called home for years. My dad sold it and moved into a small, one-bedroom apartment across town. It wasn't much, just a modest space with bare walls and secondhand furniture, but there was something about it that felt right. "It's not the house that makes a home," he said when I helped him unpack. "It's the peace inside it." And he was right. Despite its simplicity, the apartment felt lighter, freer than the house ever had during those final months of tension and deceit. My dad seemed lighter too. He took up hobbies he'd always talked about but never had time for: woodworking, gardening on the tiny balcony, and even reconnected with some old friends. For the first time in years, he seemed like himself again. My mom, on the other hand, was a different story. She stayed in the family home, but it felt emptier now, as though the walls were holding onto the echoes of everything we'd lost. She tried to keep up appearances, throwing herself into her work and pretending like everything was fine, but it was clear she was struggling. Her relationship with her business partner didn't last long. From what I heard through the grapevine, things fell apart quickly after the divorce. Whether it was guilt, incompatibility, or simply the fallout of being caught, I didn't know. And honestly, I didn't want to know. All I knew was that she seemed lonelier than ever. Whenever I visited her, I could see the cracks in her facade. The confident, composed woman I had grown up with was gone, replaced by someone who seemed adrift. She tried to fill the void with work, redecorating the house, and endless phone calls to Jason and me, but none of it seemed to help. One afternoon, as I sat in her kitchen sipping coffee, she sighed and said, "I thought I could rebuild from this, but it's harder than I expected." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to tell her things would get better, but another part of me still felt angry, hurt by the choices she had made and the way they had shattered our family. As for me, the whole experience left me feeling jaded, but also strangely resilient. Watching my parents' marriage fall apart had forced me to reevaluate everything I thought I knew about relationships, trust, and family. It wasn't an easy process, but it was a necessary one. For a while, I kept my distance from both of them, not because I didn't care, but because I needed space to process everything that had happened. I threw myself into my own life, work, friends, hobbies, and slowly started to find my footing again. I also set boundaries in ways I never had before. When my mom called to vent about my dad or the divorce, I politely but firmly told her I couldn't be her sounding board. When my dad tried to draw me into his anger toward her, I reminded him that I wasn't there to take sides. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. For so long, I had felt caught in the middle of their conflict, trying to navigate the fallout without losing myself in the process. Setting boundaries allowed me to reclaim a sense of agency, to focus on my own healing instead of constantly mediating theirs. Despite everything, there were moments of hope and growth. My dad and I became closer than we had ever been before. Without the tension of the marriage weighing him down, he was able to be more open, more present. We started having regular dinners, just the two of us, where we talked about everything from work to movies to the future. "I'm proud of you," he told me one night over takeout, "for how you've handled all of this. It couldn't have been easy." "It wasn't," I admitted, "but I learned a lot." "And what did you learn?" he asked, genuinely curious. I thought about it for a moment before replying. That people aren't perfect, and that sometimes you have to let go of the idea of what you thought your family was to accept what it is. He nodded thoughtfully. "That's a hard lesson to learn," he said, "but an important one." My relationship with my mom remained more complicated. There were moments when I could see glimpses of the woman she used to be, the loving, supportive mom who baked cookies and stayed up late to help with school projects. But those moments were often overshadowed by the tension and the unspoken pain that lingered between us. She apologized often, but her apologies always felt tinged with self-pity. "I never meant to hurt anyone," she told me during one visit. I don't know what I was thinking. I didn't know how to respond." On some level, I believed her, believed that she hadn't set out to destroy our family. But that didn't erase the damage she had done or the trust she had broken. In the end, my family would never be the same. The cracks in our foundation were too deep, the wounds too fresh. But despite everything, I was determined not to let the experience define me. I focused on rebuilding my own life, on finding strength in the lessons I had learned. I learned to value honesty, to set boundaries, and to prioritize my own well-being, even in the face of family turmoil. And while the pain of the past would always linger, I also found hope in the possibility of a better future. A future where I could take the lessons of the past and use them to build something stronger, something more resilient. Over time, life began to settle into a new normal. It wasn't the life any of us had envisioned, but it was the one we were left with, and somehow, we had to figure out how to move forward. For my dad, moving forward meant taking a chance on something I never thought I'd see again: dating. At first, it was surreal. The idea of my dad swiping through dating apps or meeting someone new felt almost impossible to wrap my head around. But little by little, he started to put himself out there. The first time he mentioned it to me, it was almost offhand. "I've been talking to someone," he said one evening while we were catching up over dinner. "Talking to someone?" I repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah," he said, smiling sheepishly. "We met through a mutual friend. It's nothing serious yet." I could see the nervous excitement in his eyes, and as strange as it was to imagine my dad starting over, it also made me happy to see him smiling again. The first time I met the woman he was dating, a kind, down-to-earth nurse named Linda, I wasn't sure what to expect. Would it feel like she was replacing my mom? Would it be awkward or forced? But Linda quickly put me at ease. She wasn't trying to step into my mom's shoes or pretend to be something she wasn't. Instead, she treated my dad with genuine warmth and respect, and I could see how much he appreciated her. "She makes me feel like myself again," my dad confided in me after one of their dates. Seeing him happy made it easier to accept the changes in our family. It wasn't about erasing the past or pretending the pain didn't exist. It was about finding joy again, even in the wake of loss. Meanwhile, my mom focused her energy on repairing her relationships with Jason and me. It wasn't an easy process. There were moments when old wounds reopened, and the anger bubbled back to the surface, especially during those first few months after the divorce. She reached out often, sometimes too often, asking if we wanted to come over for dinner or go for a walk. Jason, ever the peacemaker, was quicker to forgive than I was. He started visiting her more frequently, and while he still harbored some resentment, he seemed willing to let her back into his life. For me, it was more complicated. Every time I saw her, I couldn't help but think about what she had done. The betrayal was too fresh, too raw. But I also couldn't deny that she was trying. She apologized repeatedly, not just for the affair, but for the way she had handled everything afterward. "I know I've hurt you," she said one afternoon as we sat in her living room, "and I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. But I want to earn back your trust, even if it takes the rest of my life." Her words felt genuine, but trust is a fragile thing. It takes time to rebuild, and even then, the cracks often remain. Despite the difficulties, we found a way to coexist. It wasn't the same as before. How could it be? But it was something. We shared dinners occasionally, celebrated birthdays, and exchanged small talk about work and life. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. One evening, after a family dinner, my mom pulled me aside and said, "Thank you for giving me another chance." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to say, "You don't deserve it." But another part of me, the part that still loved her despite everything, said, "I'm trying." And I was. Looking back, I realized that families are far from perfect. They're messy and complicated, full of contradictions and unresolved conflicts. Sometimes, they break in ways you can't fix. But even in their brokenness, they're still worth fighting for, at least, the parts that matter. For my dad, moving forward meant embracing a new chapter of his life, one that was filled with hope and possibility. For my mom, it meant facing her mistakes head-on and making amends where she could. For me, it meant learning to let go, not of the pain, but of the need to control the narrative. It meant accepting that my family would never be what it once was, but also recognizing that there was still love to be found in the pieces we had left. As time went on, The wounds began to heal, slowly but surely. The anger that had once consumed me started to fade, replaced by a quiet understanding that people are flawed, and sometimes, those flaws lead them to make choices that hurt the ones they love most. It wasn't about forgetting or pretending the past didn't happen. It was about finding a way to live with it, to let it shape me without defining me. And as I looked around at the people who mattered most, my dad, finally happy again. My mom, working to rebuild what she had broken. Jason, navigating the tightrope between us all. I realized that while our family would never be the same, it was still worth holding on to. In the end, this experience taught me more than I ever wanted to know about betrayal, forgiveness, and what it truly means to move on. I used to think families were unbreakable, that the bonds we shared could withstand anything. But the past year had shattered that illusion, forcing me to confront the uncomfortable truth. People are flawed, families are fragile, and sometimes, even the strongest relationships can fall apart. My parents' marriage may have ended, but the lessons they taught me, both good and bad, will stay with me forever. Their story became a roadmap for everything I want to avoid in my own relationships, a reminder of the importance of honesty, communication, and trust. But it also taught me that even in the face of betrayal, there's still room for growth, healing, and second chances, though they don't always look the way you expect. Forgiveness, I've learned, isn't about erasing the past or pretending the pain didn't happen. It's about making peace with it, about letting go of the anger and resentment, not for the person who hurt you, but for yourself. My relationship with my mom remains complicated. We still talk, but there's a distance between us that wasn't there before, a quiet barrier that neither of us knows how to fully dismantle. She tries, though. I'll give her that. She checks in regularly, asking about my life, my work, my friends. And there are moments, brief, fleeting moments, where I catch glimpses of the mom I used to know, the one who always had my back, who cheered me on from the sidelines at soccer games and stayed up late helping me study for exams. But those moments are often overshadowed by the weight of everything that's happened. I don't know if she'll ever fully make amends, but I've come to accept that it's her journey to take. Forgiving her doesn't mean excusing her actions, and rebuilding our relationship doesn't mean forgetting the pain she caused. It's a balancing act, one that I'm still figuring out. As for my dad, he's found peace in his new life. Watching him rebuild himself after the divorce has been both heartbreaking and inspiring. There were times when I worried he might never recover, that the pain of betrayal would consume him. But slowly, he found a way to move forward. He's still with Linda, and their relationship seems to bring him a sense of joy and stability that I hadn't seen in years. They travel together, host small gatherings at his apartment, and spend weekends exploring new hobbies. It's strange to think of my dad as part of a new couple, but it's also comforting to see him happy again. I never thought I'd be here, he told me one evening as we sat on his balcony, watching the sun set over the city. But sometimes, life surprises you. You think it's over, and then you find a new beginning. I couldn't be happier for him. The real lesson in all of this? People make mistakes, sometimes big ones, but it's up to us to decide what we carry forward. For so long, I clung to the anger and the pain, believing that letting go would mean letting my mom off the hook. But I've realized that holding on to those feelings only hurt me in the end. Moving on doesn't mean erasing the past. It doesn't mean forgetting what happened or pretending it didn't matter. It means finding a way to live with it, to let it shape you without defining you. In the months since the divorce, I've started to rebuild my own life, piece by piece. I've focused on the things that bring me joy and fulfillment, on the relationships that lift me up rather than weigh me down. And while the scars of the past are still there, they no longer control me. Looking back, I see now that families aren't perfect. They're messy and complicated, full of love and pain in equal measure. Sometimes they break in ways you can't fix, but even in their brokenness, there's beauty to be found. For all its flaws, my family is still my family. And while we may never go back to the way things were, we've found a new kind of normal. One that's messy and imperfect but filled with hope for the future. Sometimes, the best thing you can do is let go and start fresh.